So lately, I've been really interested in how Buddhism approaches suffering, And I thought it would be fascinating to kind of dive into that a little bit today. We've got these two YouTube videos, Don't Suffer More Than Needed, and that other one, How to Navigate Through Painful Situations in Life.
Okay, yeah, I've seen those.
And they both kind of get at this question, can you actually suffer less, even when, life is throwing all these curveballs at you?
It's interesting because Buddhism doesn't actually say we can avoid pain. Pain's kind of a given, right?
Right.
Physical pain, emotional pain, it's all part of being human. But suffering, that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, and one of the videos had this quote, I think it might have been the first one that really stuck with me. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Yeah, it's a tough one to wrap your head around.
It really is. So how does that even work?
Well, it kind of goes against our natural instincts, right? Buddhism talks about these 8 worldly winds, things like pleasure and pain, gain and loss, praise and blame. And most of us were constantly chasing after the pleasant ones and then pushing away the unpleasant ones.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And it's exhausting. And all that chasing and resisting, that's actually what creates suffering. Because instead of seeing those things as fleeting, always changing, like the wind, we cling to them or we push them away.
So you're saying the key to suffering less is to just accept everything life throws at us.
Not quite. It's not just passive acceptance. It's more about understanding. Let's say you experience a loss, like the loss of a loved one. The pain of that loss, that's real. And it's important to acknowledge that pain. But what often happens is we add on a second layer of suffering on top of the initial pain.
Like blaming ourselves or feeling angry at the world for being unfair.
Exactly. And this is where that Buddhist parable about the 2 arrows comes in. Are you familiar with that one?
Vaguely, yeah.
Okay, so picture this. You're walking through life and bam, suddenly you're struck by an arrow, right?
Ouch.
And that hurts. That first arrow, that's the unavoidable pain of life, like that loss we were talking about.
Okay, I'm feeling that first arrow. So what's the second one?
That second arrow is our reaction to the pain. It's the blame, the anger, the why me stories we tell ourselves.
Oh, wow.
That second arrow, that's optional. And that's actually the arrow, we might call it suffering or unsatisfactoriness, that often causes even more pain than the first arrow.
It's like we're shooting ourselves in the foot right after getting hit by that first arrow.
Exactly.
So, how do we dodge that second arrow? Both videos talked about mindfulness, but I have to admit, sometimes that word feels a little vague to me. What does that actually look like in practice, when you're facing a difficult situation?
It's about becoming aware of the gap between those 2 arrows, like hitting the pause button before we react automatically. So instead of immediately going into that fight or flight mode and that second arrow appears, we can take a breath, observe our thoughts and feelings, without judgment, and then choose a more helpful response.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do you actually create that space, that pause? When it feels like, your emotions are just completely taking over, that's got to be easier said than done.
It is, and that's why it's called a practice.
That's right.
It's not about being perfect at it. It's about cultivating that awareness over time. And one of the most effective ways to cultivate mindfulness is through meditation.
Meditation,
Yeah.
right. That's not exactly a new concept,
Right.
but I'm guessing there's more to it than, just sitting there trying to clear your mind.
Exactly. It's not about emptying your mind. It's more about becoming an observer of your thoughts, noticing those thoughts without getting carried away by them. Kind of like watching clouds drift by.
Okay.
And the more you practice, the better you become at catching those second arrow thoughts before they really have a chance to cause you more suffering.
So meditation helps us kind of train our minds to become more aware of those automatic reactions. But what about the actual content of those thoughts? Those stories we tell ourselves, like, this always happens to me, or I'm not good enough. How do we actually deal with those kinds of negative thought patterns?
That's where another key Buddhist concept comes in. Impermanence.
Okay.
Recognizing that everything is constantly changing, even our thoughts and feelings. And that can be incredibly liberating
Yeah.
because it's about realizing that those negative thoughts, as real as they feel in the moment, they're not permanent fixtures in our minds. They'll pass, just like everything else.
So by recognizing impermanence, we can kind of loosen the grip of those negative thoughts.
Exactly. We begin to see them more like passing weather systems in the mind, rather than these concrete realities.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean we ignore them. It's more like we observe them with curiosity and allow them to pass without, getting totally swept away.
That actually reminds me of those 8 worldly winds we were talking about earlier. If we're always chasing after praise and pleasure and resisting, pain and criticism. No wonder we're exhausted and suffering all the time.
It's a recipe for turmoil, isn't it?
Hmm.
One of the videos, I think is the second one, used this great analogy of being a sailor. Imagine you're trying to sail a ship, but you're constantly fighting against the wind and the waves. I mean, you're going to exhaust yourself,
Hmm.
and you'll probably capsize.
That's kind of a terrifying thought.
It is. But what if instead of fighting against those elements, we learned how to work with them? A skilled sailor, they adjust their sails to the changing winds, and they navigate the waves to get where they need to go. They don't waste energy trying to control the uncontrollable.
So how do we become those skilled sailors of our own minds? How do we navigate those worldly winds without, you know, getting tossed around?
Mindfulness. It's the practice of paying attention to the present moment without judgment. It's about noticing those worldly whims, those cravings, those aversions, but without getting, completely swept away by them.
So mindfulness is kind of like our compass and rudder, helping us chart a course through like those really turbulent waters.
Exactly. And just like learning any skill, it takes practice. But the more we practice mindfulness, the more space we create between those first and second arrows.
And that space, that pause, that's where we find our freedom to choose a different response.
Precisely. We start to recognize that we're not our thoughts, we're not our emotions. We actually have the power to choose how we respond to them.
So instead of like getting hooked by every single thought that drifts by, we can
Yeah.
start to choose which thoughts we want to engage with and which ones we can just, let go of.
You got it. It's like having a bouncer at the door of our minds.
Okay.
We get to decide which thoughts and emotions we're going to give our energy and attention to.
I like that analogy. It puts us back in the driver's seat.
Exactly. And when we're in the driver's seat, we're a lot less likely to fire off those second arrows of suffering. We can navigate those ups and downs of life with a lot more grace and ease.
So it's not about like becoming immune to the challenges of life, right? It's more about learning how to like ride those waves with more skill and more resilience.
Exactly. And the beautiful thing is, this ability to navigate challenges with more grace and ease, it's not something we're born with or without. It's a skill. And like any skill, we can cultivate it through practice.
So even if we've spent our whole lives, firing off those second arrows, it's never too late to learn a new way of being.
Never. Every moment is an opportunity to begin again, to choose mindfulness over reactivity, to choose compassion over judgment, and to choose wisdom over ignorance.
That's a really empowering message.
It is, and it's a message that's at the heart of, all the Buddhist teachings. We all have this incredible potential to awaken to a life of greater peace and freedom. And it's not some far-off destination. It's available to us right here, right now.
But how do we actually access that peace and freedom, in the midst of our busy, crazy lives? I mean, it's easy to talk about, mindfulness and meditation, but what about when we're juggling work and family and just all the demands of modern life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the good news is, even small moments of mindfulness, they can make a big difference.
So we don't have to like quit our jobs and move to a monastery to start practicing mindfulness.
Not unless you want to.
Okay, good to know.
There are tons of ways to weave mindfulness into our everyday lives. It can be as simple as just taking a few conscious breaths before answering an email, or really savoring the taste of your food.
So it's about finding those little pockets of stillness throughout the day.
Exactly. And those little pockets, they add up over time. They can have a really profound impact on our overall well-being.
I imagine it takes some effort, though, to actually remember to like pause and be mindful throughout the day. Like our minds are kind of good at keeping us stuck on autopilot.
You're not wrong. That's why it can be really helpful to have some kind of reminder.
Like setting an alarm on our phones to remind us to take a few deep breaths.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or even just putting a sticky note on your computer screen with the word breathe on it.
Okay.
It's like giving our minds a gentle nudge in the right direction.
I like that.
Because sometimes that's all it takes. Just a little reminder to come back to the present moment, to notice what's happening without judgment. And in those moments of presence, that's where we find that freedom to choose a more skillful response.
And those skillful responses, those kind of create a ripple effect, don't they? Like it's not just about us.
Absolutely. When we're able to respond to those challenges with more mindfulness, with more compassion, it creates a more peaceful and harmonious environment, for everyone around us.
So by cultivating our own inner peace, we're actually contributing to a more peaceful world.
Exactly. It all starts with each of us making the choice to kind of like put down the bow and arrow,
Right.
to stop firing those second arrows of suffering.
and to embrace this like wild, crazy ride called life with a little more grace and a lot more mindfulness.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
You know, it's amazing how much even small shifts in perspective can really change how we experience life. We've been talking about this idea of becoming skilled sailors, navigating those worldly winds with more grace and ease. But I think it might be helpful to, talk about how to actually do that. Because I'm sure a lot of people listening are thinking like, okay, easier said than done.
Right.
Putting these principles into practice, in the real world, that can be challenging. So what are some concrete tools or techniques we can use to actually cultivate more mindfulness so we can actually like start dodging those second arrows?
Well, we've talked about meditation and how powerful it can be for training the mind. But mindfulness isn't limited to, just formal meditation practice. We can integrate it into our everyday lives in so many ways.
That's good to hear because I'll be honest, I don't always have time to meditate for an hour every day.
Right, and most people don't. Even just, a few minutes of conscious breathing can make a world of difference. The key is to just find what works for you and be patient with yourself.
So, besides those breathing exercises, what are some other simple ways to kind of bring mindfulness into those everyday moments?
One really powerful practice is cultivating what's called sensory awareness. Our senses are constantly being bombarded with information, right? But we rarely take the time to really, truly experience them.
So, like, instead of rushing through my morning coffee, I could actually slow down and like savor the aroma, the taste, even just, the warmth of the mug in my hand.
Exactly. Or how about when you're walking from your car to the office? Instead of, scrolling through your phone, how about just looking around, noticing the colors, the shapes, the sounds around you? These little moments might seem, kind of insignificant, but they're actually really valuable opportunities to step out of that autopilot mode and just reconnect with the present moment.
It's about finding those little pauses throughout the day to really appreciate like the richness of our actual experience.
Yes, exactly. And as we cultivate this sensory awareness, we actually start to see the world with fresh eyes. And we begin to appreciate those simple things that we might have been overlooking before.
It's like we're waking up to the beauty that's always been right there in front of
And
us.
isn't that a wonderful way to live?
It really is. And it makes me think about how, these Buddhist principles, they're not just about reducing suffering, they're also about, cultivating a deeper appreciation for life itself.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about recognizing that even in the midst of, difficulty or challenges, there's always something to be grateful for.
And maybe even more importantly, it's about recognizing that those difficult moments, those arrows of life, they often hold valuable lessons if we're open to learning from them.
Absolutely. It's about shifting our perspective from why is this happening to me to what can I learn from this?
So instead of seeing those arrows as like the enemy, we can actually start to see them as our teachers.
And incredibly wise teachers at that.
Well said. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground today, from the eight worldly winds to the parable of the two arrows to the importance of mindfulness and sensory awareness. But if there's one thing I want our listeners to take away from this whole deep dive, it's that we have a lot more power than we think when it comes to our own experience.
Yes. And that power, it comes from cultivating awareness and compassion and just the courage to choose a different response,
Even when life throws those inevitable curveballs our way.
especially them.
So as we're wrapping up here, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. What if the next time you feel that first arrow of pain, you greet it not with fear or resistance, but with curiosity and a willingness to learn? What if that arrow, instead of leading to more suffering, could actually guide you towards greater peace and freedom? It's a journey worth taking, wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into, the art of suffering less. We hope you found some valuable insights and practices you can take with you on your own journey.
Yes.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep embracing the fullness of this kind of messy, beautiful life.
And may we all find the wisdom and compassion to navigate it with grace and ease.